Greetings and welcome to episode 3 of KurtApproved. My name's Kurt Wilson. Um, First episode we kind of covered who I was, how the name came about, and all of that. And then episode 2 was the beginning of the influencers. And it kind of amazed me how quick time flew by, and next thing I know I was coming up on an hour, and we'd only covered 3 of the influencers that I singled out, from Mikhail Gorbachev to Churchill to Martin Luther King, and got quite a stack of others that I'd like to cover. We'll see how these go. Um, like I said in episode 2, these were a list put together that I found via the Google, and then kind of just went through and grabbed the ones that either had some type of influence on me or had a grand influence on the world. Leaders that are individuals who ended up on the world stage either by their choice or by the interaction or device they created, or the moment in time where they were able to use science, math, or something and discover something. So, the first one that I want to touch on this episode is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's name is well known, I would think, throughout the world. So, to the biography. Lincoln was born February 2nd, 1809, in a single-room log cabin. And it wasn't in Illinois. He was born in Hardin County, Kentucky. His family upbringing was modest. His parents from Virginia were neither wealthy or well-known. At an early age, the young Abraham lost his mother, and his father moved away to Indiana. Abraham had to work hard splitting logs and other manual labor, but he also had a thirst for knowledge and worked very hard to excel in his studies. This led him to become self-trained as a lawyer. Can you imagine that in this day and age? Self-training yourself to become a lawyer. Back to the biography. He spent 8 years working on the Illinois court circuit. His ambition, drive, and capacity for hard work were evident to all around him. Lincoln became respected on the legal circuit, and he gained the nickname Honest Abe. He often encouraged neighbors to work their problems out amongst themselves rather than involve him or the courts. Litigation was always the last option for him. Lincoln also had a good sense of humor. So, work colleagues and friends noted that Lincoln had a capacity to diffuse tense and argumentative situations through the use of humor, and his capacity to take on optimistic view of human nature. He loved to tell stories to illustrate a serious point through the use of humor. Lincoln was shy around women, but after a difficult courtship, he married Mary Todd in 1842. Mary Todd shared many of her husband's political thinking, but they also had different temperaments, with Mary more prone to swings in her emotions. The yin and the yang, often what we see in most relationships. Back to the biography. They had 4 children who Lincoln was devoted to, although 3 died before reaching maturity. which caused much grief for both parents. His interest in public issues encouraged him to stand for public office. In 1847, he was elected to the House of Representatives for Illinois and served from 1847 to 1849, just 2 years. During his period in Congress, Lincoln criticized President Polk's handling of the American-Mexican War, arguing Polk used patriotism and military glory to defend the unjust action of taking Mexican territory. However, Lincoln's stance was politically unpopular, and he was not reelected. So rather than go with the popular ways of the day, he stood his ground, and it cost him his seat. Back to the biography. After his political career appeared to be over, he returned to working as a lawyer in Illinois. However, the 1850s saw the slavery question reemerge as a prominent national issue. Lincoln regarded slavery with disgust and hatred, and from a political perspective, wished to prevent slavery being extended or ultimately be phased out. He gave influential speeches, which drew on the Declaration of Independence to prove the Founding Fathers had intended to stop the spread of slavery. In particular, Lincoln used a novel argument that although society was a long way from equality, America should aspire towards the lofty statement in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Lincoln had a strong capacity for empathy. He would try to see problems from everyone's point of view, including Southern slaveholders. He used this concept of empathy to speak against slavery. I have always thought that all men should be free, but if any should be slaves, it should be first those who desire it for themselves, and secondarily, those who desire it for others. When I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see if tried on them. I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. So Lincoln's argument was, if you want slaves, let's try it on you and your family and such first, and see how you like it. Back to the biography. In 1858, Lincoln was nominated as Republican candidate for Senate. He undertook a sense of high-profile debates with the Democrat incumbent Stephen Douglas. Douglas was in favor for allowing the extension of slavery, if citizens voted for it. Lincoln opposed the extension of slavery. During his campaign, he gave one of the best-remembered speeches, which reflected on the divergent nature of America. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure. Permanently, half slave, half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. And I think this is something people have heard and maybe thought this was a speech he gave when he was president. But the House Divided is a speech that is probably referenced quite a bit. Back to the biography. Although he lost the 1858 Senate election, his debating skills caused him to become well known within the Republican Party. On February 27, 1860, Lincoln was also invited to give a notable address at Cooper, Union in New York. The East Coast was relatively new territory for Lincoln. Many in the audience thought his appearance awkward and even ugly, but his calls for moral clarity over the wrongness of slavery struck a chord with the East Coast audience. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare do our duty as we understand it. The reputation he gained on the campaign trail and speeches on the East Coast caused him to be put forward as a candidate for the Republican nominee for president in 1860. Lincoln was an outsider because he had much less experience than other leading candidates such as Stewart, Bates, and Chase. But after finishing second on the first ballot, he went on to become the unexpected nominee. After a hard-fought campaign of 1860, Lincoln was elected the first Republican president of the United States. Lincoln's support came entirely from the North and the West of the country. The South strongly disagreed with Lincoln's position on slavery. The election of Lincoln as president in 1861 sparked the South to secede from the North. Southern independent sentiment had been growing for many years, and as the election of the president and the election of a president opposed to slavery was the final straw. However, Lincoln resolutely opposed the breakaway of the South, and this led to the American Civil War, with Lincoln committed to preserving the Union. Lincoln surprised many by including in his cabinet the main rivals from the 1860 Republican campaign. It demonstrated Lincoln's willingness and ability to work with people of different political and personal approaches. This helped to keep the Republican Party together. So here he goes, he gets into office, and rather than surround himself with like-minded people, he chooses people from the other side to join him. This is a key element in being successful at anything, any type of leadership, any type of business plan, is if you surround yourself with people that have the same like-mindedness, you're only hearing one side. Back to the biography. The Civil War was much more costly than many people anticipated, and at times Lincoln appeared to be losing the support of the general population. But Lincoln's patient leadership and willingness to work with the Unionist Democrats held the country together. Initially, the war was primarily about the succession of the southern states and the survival of the Union. But as the war progressed, Lincoln increasingly made the issue of ending slavery paramount. On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln declared the freedom of slaves within the Confederacy. All persons held as slaves within any state or distinguished part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. The proclamation came into force on January 1st, 1863. Towards the end of the year, many black regiments were raised to help the Union Army. So here he is declaring everybody free, even in the states that had succeeded. Hearts and minds. That, and I'm sure the thought process was, the more support down in the South, the easier the war is going to be. After difficulty opening 2 years. By 1863, the tide of the war started to swing towards the Union forces. Helped by victory at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Lincoln felt able to redefine the goal of the Civil War to include the ending of slavery. Dedicating the ceremony at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, Lincoln declared, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal," referring back to the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence. I misspoke there. Yeah, to that Declaration. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that's all from the Gettysburg Address, 19th November 1863. Eventually, after 4 years of attrition, the federal forces secured the surrender of the defeated South. The Union had been saved, and the issue of slavery had been brought to a head. So after the Civil War, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Lincoln sought to reunite the country, offering generous settlements to the South. When asked how to deal with the Southern states, Lincoln replied, "Let 'em up easy." On 31 January 1865, Lincoln helped pass through Congress a bill to outlaw slavery. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was officially signed into law on 6 December 1865. Some Northern Republicans wanted Lincoln to go further and implement full racial equality on issues of education and voting rights. Lincoln was unwilling to do this. It was a minority political view for the time. Frederick Douglass, a leading black activist who had escaped from slavery, didn't always agree with the policies of Lincoln, but after meeting Lincoln, he was enthusiastic of the president. Douglass was quoted as saying, "He treated me as a man. He did not let me feel for a moment that there was any difference in the color of our skins. The president is a most remarkable man. I am satisfied now that he is doing all that circumstances will permit him to do." And then 5 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while visiting Ford's Theater. So it gets the war to completion, and 5 days after, the president's assassinated. So posterity will call you the Great Emancipator. That was from, there's so many, different people who've reflected back. Martin Luther King Jr., 5 years ago, a great American whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of the withering injustice. Came as a joyous daybreak to end a long night of their captivity. There's more to Lincoln than what's just right there, what I just said. This biography pretty much does a quick once-over of Lincoln the man, and all what he did. There's stories of him having an office above the courtroom and listening and jumping through a trap door. So there's a nice quick overview of Lincoln there, but doesn't really dive into Lincoln the man, from his youth to the lawyer years to even being president. The family dynamic with Mary and his kid. So maybe at a later date we'll dive down into Lincoln a little more. The next one on that list was Nelson Mandela. And Mandela was born 18th July of 1918 in South Africa. He was the son of the local tribal leader. As a youngster, Nelson took part in the activities and ceremonies of the local tribe. However, like his father, Nelson was able to gain a full education. Was able to go to college. It was said that he was a good student. And then in 1942, qualified or graduated with a law degree. During his time at university, Mandela became increasingly aware of the racial inequality and injustice faced by non-white people. In 1943, he decided to join the ANC and actively take a part in the struggle against the oppressed. As one of the few qualified lawyers, Nelson was in great demand. Also, his commitment to the cause saw him promoted through the ranks of the ANC. 1956, Nelson Mandela, along with several other members of the ANC, were arrested and charged with treason. After a lengthy court case, the defendants were finally acquitted in 1961. However, with the ANC now banned, Nelson suggested an active armed resistance to the regime. This led to the formation of a guerrilla resistance movement. And they took part in sabotaging activity. And then in 1963, Mandela was again arrested, put on trial for treason. This time the state succeeded in convicting Mandela of plotting to overthrow the government. So 61 goes on trial, gets acquitted. 63 goes on trial and this time is convicted. The trial took until 64. And here's his closing remark. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if need be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. So here he's standing up and closing arguments saying, I'm not for one race being in more control. What we need is equality for all. So he does get sentenced. Mandela's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment and from 1964 to 1981. In prison, the conditions were sparse. However, Mandela was with many other political prisoners, and there was a strong bond of friendship which helped to make more bearable the difficulty prison conditions. Also, in prison, Nelson Mandela was highly disciplined. He would try and study and take part in exercise every day. He later said these years of incarceration in jail was a period of great learning, even if painful. Mandela also created friendships with some of the guards. Mandela would later say that he felt he was fighting the system and not individual white people. So here's a guy that's prison, but he follows his discipline. Still learning, still exercising. Back to the biography. During his time in prison, Mandela became increasingly well known throughout the world. Mandela became the best known black leader and was symbolic of the struggle against the regime. Largely unknown to Mandela, his continued imprisonment led to a worldwide pressure for his release. Many countries implemented sanctions on South Africa. Due to international pressure from the mid-1980s, the regime increasingly began to negotiate with the ANC and Nelson Mandela in particular. On many occasions, Mandela was offered a conditional freedom. However, he always refused to put the political ideas of the ANC above his own freedom. So he's got an opportunity to get out of prison, and he's like, no, I'm going to stay true to these ideals. Back to the biography. Eventually, Nelson Mandela was released. On 11th February 1990, the day was a huge event for South Africa and the world. His release, symbolic of the impending end of the regime and the oppression. Following his release, there followed negotiations to secure a lasting settlement. The negotiations were tense, often against the backdrop of tribal violence. However, in April 1994, South Africa had its first full and fair elections. The ANC, with 65% of the vote, were elected, and Nelson Mandela became the first president of the new South Africa. And he was quoted, "The time for healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us." So 4 years after being released, he's president of the South Africa. To go from being controlled and sought for treason, they have open election, and he wins. So, back to the biography. As president, he sought to heal the rifts of the past. Despite being mistreated, his forgiving and tolerant attitude gained the respect of the whole South African nation and considerably eased the transition to full democracy. Nelson would retire from the presidency in 1999. And this biography here doesn't really do the man justice. Stood his ground, became the voice of a whole country, even bigger than that. Definitely somebody that's totally worth taking the time to learn about. But the guiding light was his principles and his ideals, that he stayed true to those. He might have had to bend, but he never broke. Just to stand there and stand his ground. The next one on that list is Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States. FDR was born 30th January 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, to a wealthy family. He was brought up with a privileged background, but was influenced by his headmaster at the school in Massachusetts, who inculcated the importance of a Christian duty in the helping less fortunate people. After school, he went to Harvard, where he studied economics. He was an unremarkable student, but became editor of the Harvard Crimson, which suited his capacities to manage other people. In 1905, Franklin married a distant cousin, Eleanor. They'd end up having 6 children in quick succession, 2 of them who went on to be elected to the House of Representatives. FDR had several affairs outside of his marriage, including with a Lucy Mercer, his social secretary. His wife Eleanor offered a divorce at one point, but for a variety of reasons, it was not taken up. She later became a dedicated wife/nurse during Franklin's slow disability brought on by polio. Could have easily left that part out about the affairs and all of that, but it's key on understanding FDR and Eleanor for that matter. Back to biography. In 1929, FDR was elected governor of New York. This proved a springboard to launch his bid for Democratic nominee for 1932. With America facing an unprecedented economic crisis, with unemployment reaching 25%, Roosevelt was able to win a landslide, offering hope to those made destitute by the Great Depression. To some extent, FDR pursued an expansionary financial policy as advocated by John M. Keyes. The government borrowed, levied a national income tax, and spent money on public works known as the New Deal. Probably could do a whole podcast on the New Deal, everything that it accomplished, and what FDR did with it. Back to the biography. Roosevelt also helped introduce legislation protecting workers' rights. The New Deal did not solve the economic crisis, but it did mitigate some of the worst effects, creating unemployment and eventually kickstarting the economy. By the end of the 1930s, some sectors of the economy, such as construction, were booming. The recovery was enough to help Roosevelt win re-election in 1936. In 1940, with Nazi Germany sweeping through Europe, Roosevelt decided to break with convention and become the first president to run for a third term. He won the 1940 election in another landslide. So here's a guy that's watching everything that's going on and thinking, wow, everything going on, in Europe. I'm the best guy to stay in power to see the United States through this upcoming World War. Back to biography. FDR was keen for America to become a good citizen of the world and fight for certain freedoms. In 1940, he campaigned for re-election, promising to stay out of World War II. Despite his own dislike for Nazi Germany. However, in 1941, as the Britain situation deteriorated, FDR did skillfully negotiate a generous land lease program which helped Great Britain financially when it stood alone against Hitler. Roosevelt used the analogy of lending a neighbor a house pipe when their house was burning down. House pipe's another word for hose, water hose. Back to the biography. His skill helped pass the bill through a reluctant Congress. And then the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 1941, completely changed the outlook of America. FDR wasted no time in declaring war on Japan and then Germany as well. In these days of difficulty, we Americans everywhere must and shall choose the path of social justice, the path of faith, the path of hope, and the path of love towards our fellow man. I think most people have heard the "and this day will go down" speech, So back to biography. Once America had entered the war, they entered wholeheartedly in both arenas, the Pacific and Europe. In the D-Day landings, America supplied roughly two-thirds of the troops. Roosevelt was an astute commander-in-chief. In particular, he was able to identify generals with genuine talent and promote them to key roles. As Roosevelt said himself, "I am not the smartest fellow in the world, but I sure can pick smart colleagues." In particular, FDR promoted Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall, both to play key roles in the Second World War. I think what FDR said there is what smart people do. You know your weaknesses, you know the areas you're deficient in, and you find people that thrive in those areas. And you surround you with people who are going to make up for your own shortcomings. And when you surround yourself with those people, you learn. And maybe those shortcomings of yours go away or the gap gets smaller. And there are some areas that people never progress in. But right here, perfect leader, example of good leadership. He knew that he wasn't going to be that guy to be able to do all that. But man, could he find the people that could. So back to the biography. Roosevelt Fireside Chats. Roosevelt's real political skill lay in the powers of communication and identification with ordinary people. His radio fireside chats were instrumental in building confidence with the American people, both during the Great Depression and during the Second War. So the radio this is before television. Nobody even knew what the internet was going to be or. So here's a guy that's taken the time to do weekly radio chats. Communication. If you keep everybody engaged and educate on what's going on and communicate with them the plan or what next step's going to be, or we're doing this for that, it's easier for everybody to buy in. The biggest disjustice anybody does as a leader is to not communicate. Back to biography. This great nation will endure as it has endured. Will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. And the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Was a speech that he gave when he was first elected president. Roosevelt had a close relationship with Winston Churchill. There was a strong mutual respect and admiration for him. At one point, Roosevelt said, "It is fun being in the same decade as you," about Winston. Together with Churchill and Stalin, the big three helped lay the foundation for the post-war period, which included the setting up of the United Nations, a successor to the League of Nations. Roosevelt died unexpectedly from a massive brain hemorrhage in April 1945, just before the first meeting of the United Nations. His death stunned the world, and he was remembered as a champion of freedom and the man of humanitarian and optimism. So another president that doesn't get to see the other side of the war, only gets to witness and experience all of the bad times, the death, the expense, the uncertainty. Again, a couple pages right here doesn't cover FDR and everything. First president, 3 terms, Great Depression, the Good Deal, World War II, the U.S. being attacked, Pearl Harbor, entering the war, picking the right people to be in the key spots. Just one of those guys, though, that every time you read something about him, understood what it took to be a good leader, and understood that he didn't have to be the guy making all of the decisions. Surround yourself with smart people. The next one, Charles Darwin. And I'm sure, most people are aware who Darwin is through the Darwin Awards. But was born the 12th of February, 1809. Another one that was born into wealth and an influential family. He had some grandfathers that were China manufacturers. Darwin planned to study medicine at Edinburgh University, but later, at the instigation of his father, changed to studying going to a Christian college. Darwin was not a great student, preferring to spend time in outdoor pursuits. He spent a lot of his time examining natural science and beetle collecting. After gaining a passionate interest in natural science, Darwin was offered a place on the HMS Beagle to act as a natural scientist on a voyage to the coast of South Africa. At the time, religion was a powerful force in society, and most people took the Bible as an infallible literary word of God. This included the belief that God created the world in 7 days, and the world was only a few thousand years old. However, on the voyage, Darwin increasingly began to see evidence of life being much older. In particular, suggesting that fossils were evidence of animals living hundreds of thousands of years ago. On the voyage, Darwin made notes about specimens he found on his voyages. In particular, at the Galapagos Islands, 500 miles west of South Africa, Darwin was struck by how the finch was different on each island. He noticed the finch somehow adapted to the various aspects of the particular island. So here he is on this voyage, and he's looking at all of this stuff, and he's finding stuff that contradicts what he's been taught. And being an open mind, he takes notes of all of this, and noticing that the finches was the beginning of his theory on evolution. Excuse me. In the struggle for survival, the fittest win out at the expense of their rivals, because they succeed in adapting themselves best to their environment. Right there, survival of the fittest. So Darwin continues to refine his theory and would intensively breed plants to work on his theories. However, realizing how controversial his ideas were, Darwin delayed publishing them. It was not until learning that another naturalist, Alfred Russel, Wallace, had developed similar ideas that Darwin was galvanized into publishing his own book. In 1859, the groundbreaking On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was published. It immediately gained widespread interest and attention, leading to intense debate about the contention that man, by implication, was descended from animals like the ape. So here he's got all this information, but he's afraid to publish it. But after Wallace gets his ideas published, he goes ahead and prints it. Back to the biography. Darwin was brought up in the Church of England. At one point was being trained to be an angelic priest. Like many of his generation, he took the Bible as a literary word of God and often quoted it as a source of moral authority. However, after his epic voyage to South America, he became doubtful of the Bible as a source of history. He also felt no reason why all religions couldn't be true. So, again, just a few pages. Doesn't really cover all of what Darwin did and all of that, but go from the belief, the Bible being the word, to being, well, maybe some of these other religions have the same meaning. Like I said, some of these biographies that were attached to that list were good, and some of them leave a lot of holes. Next one would be Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was born on Christmas Day in 1643 to a relative poor farming family. His father died 3 months before he was born. His mother later remarried, but her second husband did not get on with Isaac, leading to friction between Isaac and his parents. Isaac was one of the top students when he was at So Isaac attended school at King's School. Isaac was one of the top students, but before completing his studies, his mother withdrew him from school so Isaac could work as a farmer. It was only through the intervention of the headmaster that Isaac was able to return to finish his studies. He passed his final exam with very good results and was able to go to Trinity College in Cambridge. So, need help on the farm. Mom comes, takes him out of school. Headmaster's like, Isaac is showing promise. Let's just bring him back. Let him finish his studies. He can come back to the farm. Does so well on his final exam. He gets accepted to college. So, at Cambridge, back to the biography, he was able to pursue his interest in mathematics, science, and physics. At the time, the prevailing education was based on Aristotle, but Isaac was more interested in modern mathematics. Isaac Newton had a capacity to consider mathematical problems and then focus on them until he had solved the mystery behind them. His one-pointed nature led him to, and at times, be detached from the world. Sir Isaac Newton had referred to as one of the greatest geniuses of history, has been referred to as one of the greatest geniuses of history. His mathematical and scientific achievements give credence to such a view. His many accomplished in the field. So developed the theory of calculus. What else? Let's see. Discovered a new formula for pi. Used power series with confidence and revert power series. Geometry to derive solutions. Some scientific achievements. Optics. Made great advances in the study of optics. In particular, he developed the spectrum by splitting white light through a prism. Telescope. Made significant improvements to the development of the telescope. However, when his ideas were criticized by Hooke, Newton withdrew from the public debate. He developed antagonistic and hostile attitudes towards Hooke throughout his life. And then you got the mechanics and gravitation. Newton explained the three laws of motion that laid the framework for modern physics, and this involved explaining planetary movements. So how the systems and the planets moved. The most popular anecdote about Sir Isaac Newton is the story how the theory of gravitation came to him after being hit on the head with a falling apple. In reality, Nelson and his friends may have exaggerated the story. Nevertheless, it's quite likely that seeing apples fall from trees may have influenced the theory. So, right there, the old theory that he was sitting under a tree, apple hit him, may have been just made up by his buddies. And there's more to Newton than that. Like I said, some of these don't do them. The people we speak of justice, but I think most of us are familiar with Newton, So, coming up on that hour mark, gonna go ahead and wrap this one up, and then cover a few more as we go forward, and go from there. I hope you are enjoying these. Maybe I'm just talking to myself, but it never hurts to learn anything. And like I said in the prior podcast, if anybody has any books or references on the individuals that are here, or any books in general that you recommend, feel free to reach out to me. You can, the social media thing, just do a search for KurtApproved, and I'm sure you'll find me. I created Instagram and other accounts, Twitter, Facebook page. It's one way to get a hold of me. And just okay, as we wrap this up, just be careful out there. Make sure your Care Bear stays warm and fuzzy. And with that, have a good one. Take care.